In this video, we're going to be covering the basics for stylization and how chibis are generally made. After that, I'll be sharing some tips on how to improve and evolve your style. Finally, I'll be walking you through the steps I take from sketch to final result for stuff like this. But I am getting ahead of myself. What even is a chibi? To answer simply, it's a simplified drawing of a character with a lower head count in terms of proportions. So think 2 to 4 heads tall versus a typical 7 to 8, for a realistic body proportion at least. They are known to have rounded shapes, minimal detail, and distinct facial expressions. Seen most often in anime and manga, it's typically associated with cuteness and silly expressions. There are a wide variety of ways that this style can be expressed, but it all mostly boils down to this list over here. We're going to be starting with the most important one, something that's really going to impact how you draw your chibi. I mentioned this earlier, but chibis are around 2 to 4 heads tall. The more heads equals more complexity, specifically for the details and posing, when compared to the more blob-like direction you can go with just 2 heads. This here is a little guide for that. It does not need to be precise, though if ever shooting for a specific style, or if you plan to have multiple chibis that fit together in a way, you're going to want to be consistent. When drawing them, it's common to start with a circular shape plus making use of little guidelines for figuring out the head direction and facial feature placement. The torso is usually the second biggest shape present, followed by the limbs of varying lengths. Plus also, you'll need to decide whether you want joints versus just bendy little tubes. If you're just starting out or not really used to being super consistent in your art, it can definitely be helpful to have a basic reference at hand with a front-facing chibi and the proportions you're targeting. Something that becomes especially relevant as you try out more unique poses. When in doubt, if something looks off, feedback or additional art studies can be helpful, and we will be touching on that later. So the next one is facial features, or basically what you choose to include, exclude, and emphasize. When it comes to the anime manga sort of look, it's typical to exclude the nose or have really big eyes for that cute factor, though that's not to say you're limited to that. With something so stylized, you can get away with a lot, and it will still read pretty well. As a little quick note on placement, typically the lower the eyes are on the head, the more cute it feels. Wherever the eye ends is typically where you'd put that puff of the cheek, kind of like this. Next is expressions. This is very similar. In fact, I'd say it's more of a subcategory of facial features, but it's still important. They can be a challenge, specifically when it comes to pushing expressions further, though it's all dependent on your goal and what you want to convey. If it's drawn within the context of a story where characters are usually more detailed, it's great leaning into that exaggerated emotion of the scene. If you're more focused on the cuteness aspect or even the outfit and accessories, then it's perfectly okay to have a more simple expression. If you're looking to push expressions more with your chibis, it's good to pull from other sources, which can be anime and manga, because there are a lot of little shortcuts that are used for specific emotions, or there can be real life or even emojis themselves. Just by practicing this specifically, you'll build your skill in pushing emotions further in a simplified kind of way. Next is simplifying designs. After you draw the main base for your chibi, however you end up going about it, the final thing is figuring out how you want to simplify the rest of the character. And just to start, we'll be talking about the hair. In your base, identify where the hairline is and how you want the hair to flow. In my case, I often do these leaf-like swooping shapes, though you're going to want to consider your character's hair type as well as how to simplify different types of hairstyles. A big takeaway though is to look for landmarks for where things land on your reference and to try to replicate that with your chibi. For example, if a character's hair ends midway on the back, then find the equivalent for that on your chibi. Chibis are of course an exaggerated niche of drawings, so don't be afraid to add some extra oomph to it if you'd like. On a related note, clothing and accessories. While you can certainly try and incorporate as many clothing details as you can, there's often still a point where it's either too much or just impossible to fit. So if you're making a chibi version of another full-body character, for example, you're going to want to identify the most recognizable design elements of the character and what is and isn't important. Sometimes it can be hard to pick and choose, though so long as it's recognizable as the referenced character, you're doing alright. Because chibis are very exaggerated, the same can be applied to how you end up scaling different types of accessories. Think giant hats or big bow ties, for example. In the end, the goal is readability as well as just a general free flow for how you want to express your own style. I hope this helped jumpstart what to consider when making chibis. We'll be getting into finding references and inspiration next, followed by a step-by-step guide for how I made these. If you're enjoying this video, please subscribe and consider checking me out on Twitch. I do art streams. Chibis are simplified, yeah, but there's still a lot of range for how you can present them. To really know what's possible, it's important to take note when you see something unique and cool to you. The purpose of this is to help you develop your chibi art style, plus to be able to identify what does and doesn't work well. There's a lot you can do, it's just a matter of searching for it. And again, this is just about finding a direction and something to kind of measure up against. Not like in a bad way though. Just as an example, I try to keep my style roughly consistent, especially when it comes to things like merch, thumbnails, and soon enough a portfolio because I plan on starting commissions on VGen. Yay! On the other hand, when I'm just doing fun gift art or participating in something like art fights, there's no expectation for something to look a specific way, so it's a great time to just be experimental and free in whatever you do. After finding your references and thinking a bit about what you're interested in doing, the next step is just practicing and making use of other resources when necessary. You can get pretty far with just observation and art studies, but if you find that something looks off to you, or if you get constructive feedback about it, it's probably a sign to brush up on some fundamentals like anatomy, even though it seems completely unrelated sometimes. Anything you practice as an artist will indeed show elsewhere, including simpler art like chibis. It's my personal opinion, however, that you should just do whatever keeps you going, even if progress is a little slower. In the end, it's whatever works for you and whatever you have time for. Finally, my step-by-step process for how I made these. For this style, I have 6 steps. There's the rough sketch, clean sketch, line art with details, flats, and finally, final render. The first step is just getting the initial idea down. This is meant to be something quick and changeable, something you won't get attached to. It's here where references really come in handy for inspiration on types of poses you can do for your chibi. And if you're just starting out, it's okay to take stronger inspiration from poses people have made before, though you're going to want to work towards learning about how to create from your imagination and being able to source from multiple references as needed to create something that's just your own. There are many videos that go into this further, but what I can say about it is I always start with a circular head shape and work on imagining where the hands, feet, and joints will go, as well as what angle each body part is going. This is best done by breaking it down into smaller shapes and identifying the front and side of each, as though they were 3D objects that could be twisted and turned. Other things to touch up on here includes anatomy studies for how the human body moves, how foreshortening and perspective works, as well as learning how to draw quickly and loosely without being too meticulous in the early stages. It's a lot, but that kind of work will be very helpful for making chibis that feel more believable and correct, even if they're simplified. Once I get my initial idea down, I then move on to the clean sketch, which is where I bring out more clarity to the sketch to make it easier for line art later. Some people at this point actually just work from this cleaned up sketch for their line art, and that's perfectly okay. A little note here too about something I learned with my art. I found that even when something reads well at first, testing out your colors as well as flipping the canvas at this point will be very helpful to see if something still reads. Sometimes you're able to fix it, though other times it's just best to start over or ask for feedback from others at this point. Remember, the sketch is meant to be flexible and changeable, so it's better to figure out any weird things first before moving on further. Keep it loose. Try things out. You got this. The third step in my process is line art. I'll just throw this out now though that I sometimes do this thing where I take a lineless approach too, adding in the line art later on. I do this when I really want to get a good idea for how a chibi will look, and sometimes just black and white can be a bit boring to look at after a while. Anyway, the mindset at this point is more about quality and approach for how you want your line art to look. This is in contrast to before, where it was more about throwing out ideas and seeing what worked. So tips for this. Find a brush you like and are willing to work with. For me, I use a clean brush with a higher stabilization for smoother lines and for the ease of filling in with color later on. With a clean style like this, you avoid more of the troubles that comes with filling in spaces with color and it leaving gaps. It still happens, of course, but it's a little quicker to take care of. If you end up using a more textured brush, all that means is you're going to have to take more care for how you fill in a space. The other main thing you want to figure out here is how you want your line art to vary and how fine or thick it'll be overall. For this style, I've been going for a thinner line art look most of the time with only a minimal change in thickness in some areas. That's all preference in the end. The second part for line art is just any sort of detail work that you add to make it your own. For me, I started doing this thing where I circled around shadows and the highlights, and I've been enjoying the look of it, though it took a lot of experimenting, which is just going to be the case anytime you're trying to do something differently. Look, once you get it down, it will be a lot easier to repeat in the future, and voila! Your art style has just evolved. Before moving on, I do want to drop another quick tip. If you find that your line art doesn't look as good as your sketch, it's probably an issue of either line variation for thickness, jitteriness, or stiffness. Sketches often can look good because our eyes tend to pick out the best lines, though with line art, it's entirely possible to try and trace over something and it still look off in some way. The best advice I've seen for this was to make your sketch layer the lowest opacity you can and to treat the line art stage as something just completely different. It's its own kind of art. If you're not sure what to look out for, refer to any inspiration or references you've gathered and just keep on practicing. It'll click eventually. As for things like shaky line work, I recommend bumping up the stabilization of your brush. I've heard counter arguments for this too, some detailing how it's actually the way you hold your pen and whether you draw from your wrist or your arm that needs the most work in terms of drawing smoother lines. Either way, I can at the very least say that overshooting has been an ideal method for me. This being where you create the best line or curve you can, and if it ends up crossing over other line work, that's okay. You could just erase the ends and it'll be all good. Just experiment and see what works for you. After doing all these other steps, I then move on to flats. If I had gone the lineless route instead, this is actually where I'd start adding lines, though it's just a minor step switch up. Anyway, for this, you're going to want to import a reference image, one that includes the flat colors you can color pick from, unless you feel confident enough to wing it, for different light scenarios and unnatural color palettes. Tip for Procreate users! Sorry if you're not a Procreate user. For Procreate users, import your reference directly onto the canvas if you intend on picking colors from them. The built-in one shown here actually shifts the hue a bit strangely enough, so if you're aiming for accuracy, copy from the canvas. Also, if you want to keep a clean canvas, make sure to import these images as private photos. That way they won't show up and distract from the main work, if that matters to you. My final note about this is I like to keep all sections on their own layers so I can make use of the alpha lock and clipping layers later on. When going about it this way, you can end up with a lot of layers, which can sometimes be an issue depending on how big you make your canvas and what your device can handle in terms of layer count. In any case, I just merge as I need to. If you do end up going wild with the layers, do save duplicates of your file for whenever you do significant merges. This is just a precaution for any risks of Procreate crashing or for going back to a previous version, or if you just want to recopy specific layers again into your main file post-merge. After applying the flats, the final step is rendering. I use this as a sort of catch-all since I go about things in a different order sometimes. For a more cel-shaded clean look, it's really a matter of applying shadows and highlights and making use of different layer types when necessary. I would use a clean rounded brush for hard lights and shadows, as well as an airbrush for both adding onto and erasing parts for a gradient sort of feel. I sometimes even use a halftone brush just for some additional texture. Another general thing I do for other artworks is use noise and chromatic aberration to give the art a little more character and texture too, but that isn't featured here. And that's it. Those are the 6 steps I use to create Chibis, and I hope this breakdown has given you some useful tips and ideas for your own process. Remember, creating art is all about experimenting, learning, and finding what works best for you, so don't be afraid to try new things and make mistakes along the way. If you enjoyed this video and want more art tutorials, tips, or other creative vibes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye!